the recording, Dominique, when she starts.
Good afternoon. I have to take a breath after I see those videos. I have to take my heartbeat back down. As Dr. Meek said, I am Gayle Fisher-Stewart, and I'm going to be your facilitator this afternoon. And I want to thank Dr. Meeks and the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing for sponsoring this teach-in on policing in America. And I want to also thank Dominique Hardy, who is behind the scenes making the magic happen. She will keep me on track and remind me when it's time to take a break about halfway into the session. And welcome to all of you. You know, your time is valuable, and I don't take it lightly that you are here. So thank you. We will be using PowerPoint and videos, and so with technology, we pray everything goes all right. If anything happens, just come back in and we will continue. And as Dominique said, make sure that your chat is up if you haven't already enabled it, because we'll be using it. So let's just dive right in, and I can guarantee you this is going to be a bumpy ride. The last video you saw is David Grossman, and he's an instructor. He's gone around. He said he has taught police officers. And in another video, he really says this, that after you have killed, he's telling police officers, after you have killed, you will have the best sex you've ever had, that both partners are very interested in some very intense sex. There's not a whole lot of perks that come with this job. You find one, relax, and enjoy it. You saw the video clip. In 2016, the documentary Do Not Resist, which this clip was a part of, but it was deleted, was the winner of the best documentary at the Tribeca Film Festival. The clip you saw is an important one because Dave Grossman, a retired Army Ranger and West Point instructor, has taught and continues to teach police officers across the country. He teaches militarized tactics in which officers are told to see themselves at war, to see themselves as warriors, in spite of the last 10 to 15 years when we've been trying to tell police officers, you're not warriors, you are guardians. But he wants them to see themselves as warriors on the streets of our cities, and has been teaching for over 20 years. He focused on what he calls killology, the study of killing, and uses it to teach officers to kill with less hesitation. And although most police departments have stopped using him because it was discovered that the former Minnesota police officer who murdered Philando Castile had taken one of Grossman's courses, officers still take his courses, and there are officers on our streets who have taken his courses. He teaches officers to be emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically prepared to kill on the job. And if officers are prepared to do that, as he says, killing is not that big of a deal. To him, police officers are under siege, where the police are at war with the communities they serve, that they need to be prepared for battle in the communities they have sworn to serve and protect. And because of this, the police need to learn to kill with less hesitancy. Now, the theories behind his courses have been called pseudoscience by the American Journal of Psychology. But his courses, like a lot of training today, have gone virtual. And as we think about this, you know, why is it that heavily armed white people are not a threat to the police, yet unarmed black people, to include our children, are? You know, we will be dealing with some tough issues this afternoon. Issues, for some reason, people in this country seem to be afraid of. They will be looking at the police. We will be looking at the police and their role and how they must change. The civil rights activist and author James Baldwin wrote, "People who treat other people as less than human must not be surprised when the bread they have cast on the waters come floating back to them poisoned." Malcolm X cautioned us to be mindful of the chickens coming home to roost. as we look at this training provided by Dave Grossman. The producer of the film, Craig Atkinson, attended one of Grossman's classes in 2015, and his take was that Grossman's military background makes it difficult to distinguish between at-war soldiers from the police attempting to protect the community. According to Atkinson, Grossman doesn't see a difference between Fallujah and Ferguson, Missouri. And he came away appalled at what Grossman was teaching the police. Now, the entire film, Do Not Resist, is available on Amazon. And you can check out his course offerings at grossmanacademy.org. Now, has every police officer undergone this training? No, and we can be thankful for that. But we do know some departments actively enlisted his training, and other officers have taken his courses on their own. So as part of this process, part of learning about policing today, you will be given questions to take back to your chief, to your district commander, to your sheriff. And one of the questions should be, has your department or any officers participated in training offered by Dave Grossman? And we pray the answer is no. And so I must confess that I come to this topic by way of my first career as a police officer with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. I retired in 1992 with the rank of captain. And as Catherine said, I also serve as chaplain to the Tacoma Park Police Department, where I have lived for 35 years. And so I walk a thin line between being a member of the community, a former police officer, and the mother of a black son, an aunt to black nieces and nephews, and a critic of American policing. Again, I hold on to the words of James Baldwin, who said, "I love America more than any other country in this world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." Policing was good to me. I was able to live a life that my grandparents never dreamed of. I was able to rise to the ranks during a time of racial and gender discrimination inside the department and outside in the community. And yet I had to have the talk with my own son, who is now 43 years old. I needed to ensure that my son survived an encounter with the police, with whom I served every day, and those in the community in which we lived. And one day, when my son was a teenager, after schooling him on a recent change to the law, my son said, "Mama, you are the police. Why are you telling me this?" To which I answered, "Because I know how we are." The African-American author Imani Perry wrote a book called Breathe, which is really a love letter to her sons. And I attended a book talk she had, and she asked when would she be able to breathe, to not fear for her sons who are teenagers. And again, I answered that my son is 43 years old, and I still don't breathe until I know he is safe at home. And even now, home is not safe. Botham Jean, killed in his own apartment by an off-duty former Dallas police officer, Amber Geiger, who thought she was in her own apartment. And Breonna Taylor, who was killed by police officers who had bad information and whose killers still have not been arrested. And so this session is a train the trainer of sorts. It is a teach-in. It is an overview of the training that would be provided to the police department to provide police officers with a more complete understanding of the why of American policing and how they must be ever vigilant not to be sucked into its clutches. It also provides you with the language to discuss abolition of policing, defunding policing, and reforming policing. And we will do this in 3 hours. I hope it doesn't take all 3 hours, but in reality, it would take probably an entire day or more for police officers to participate in the training and an entire career to embrace it. You know, we are continuing to see demonstrations in response to the murder of George Floyd and others, and we continue to hear the cry for the end of police brutality. And we have watched the police at these demonstrations and then see them in our communities, and we hear of legislation to reform the police, to defund the police, and the possible abolition of the police. So there is a need to understand the true role of the police in our communities, especially communities of color. And so once we have some introductory information, this session will be conducted from the police officer's perspective, as if you were being taught at the police academy or having in-service training. You will then assume the role of those officers. And there will be times when information may be repeated because it is given to you first as a participant and then repeated as if you were undergoing the training as police officers. There will be times when you'll be asked questions and you'll be able to respond using the chat function. So make sure it's up and ready. Dominique, behind the scenes, will remind me when there are those questions. This topic is emotionally, physically, and spiritually draining for me. And if you are open to the potential this training has to transform policing and repair the breach, if you take this training back to your communities, you will join me in being spiritually, physically, and emotionally drained. So after the session is over, if you want a copy of the curriculum or recording of the session, please call me. So as we begin, there are 4 statements that ground this session to which you must assent. It does not mean that you agree with them, but it does mean that you will consider them for the time we are together. And if you cannot assent, it will be difficult to grasp how policing must change and why. Assent to these statements, considering these statements, provides a doorway to understand the complexities of policing in this country and why policing must change. These same 4 statements are also part of the training for police officers. But rather than having the officers assent to them, the statements would be offered as 4 truths, 4 guiding principles. And so the 4 statements are this. The United States is a racist country. People are treated differently based on color. The second, racism is baked into the DNA of this country. Some call it America's original sin. You will find out from 1619 on, racism, white supremacy was one of the founding pillars of colonial America and then the founding of this country. And they are both at the heart of our economic life then and now. The third one, the police serve as the enforcement arm of a racist society. Every country, every society needs an agency, an organization, or group of people to enforce the codified values of that country or society. Policing in this country began to maintain the laws and values of a racist society, a society built on the denigration, the dehumanization of Black people. The job of the police was then and is still now to control Black and brown bodies. And so as you hear cries to defund the police until they do their job, your response is that they are doing their job, because the job of the police in American society is to surveil and control Black and brown bodies. They will form to protect the lives and property interests of the white elite. That's what policing was. And that's what it continues to be until we, the people, change that narrative, which means that we have to change the narrators, those who actually tell the story. The police are, in fact, the most efficient and effective governmental agency we have. They actually do what they've created and are charged to do. Now, you won't see this emblazoned on the side of any police cars, and you won't see it in any mission statement. But the primary mission of police in a racist society is to control Black and brown bodies to uphold the values of that racist society. And then the last one, because we must be objective, we realize that there are 2 sides to the story. That police officers are also victims of a racist society. Most police officers, if not the majority of police officers, join policing to serve and protect. Now, are there racist police officers? Sure they are, because we draw our employees from a racist society, just like there are racists sitting in our pews at church. But the police officers become infected with racist underpinnings of policing. They found themselves between a rock and a hard place. We find police officers and police officials talking about how they feel handcuffed, how they feel put upon, how they feel abandoned by the community. Unfortunately, we are not listening to each other. As you saw in one of the videos, policing is dangerous. And officers put their lives on the line every single day. But there is a disconnect, and we are called to repair that breach. And so if you are able to assent to those 4 statements, if you are able to sit with them just for a little while, I'd like for you to indicate yes in the chat. So just put yes if you're able to sit with them for a little while. Okay. I'm beginning to see the yeses, and that's a good thing. That is a good thing. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for all of who have said that you can sit with those 4 statements that are in tension. They're the tension between what we are called to do and what we must do in this society. And so I don't see any questions thus far, so I will continue to go on. I will provide some background information, some foundational information before we get into the training as it would be delivered for police officers. And so, do Black Lives Matter? Every time we turn around, we're seeing the statement in the media, do Black Lives Matter in society? There are folks who say that the Black Lives Matter movement is a Marxist movement, but they call the civil rights movement of the 60s a communist movement. Anything that does not lift up white supremacy in this country has to be Marxist or communist. But do Black lives really matter in this country? Not really. They only mattered when we were used as beasts of burden, when we were property, when we undergirded a capitalist system, and that system continues. It's called mass incarceration. And so I warn you, this session will probably make you uncomfortable, and it is designed to make police officers uncomfortable. Because if we're going to shake the foundation of policing in this country, we've got to trouble the waters. Lately on the news, we've heard cries for reform, that reforming the police is needed. But in truth, the police have been reforming since the uprisings of the 1960s. In fact, we have been reforming the police since the 1930s. We were in the reform period of policing until the 1980s, when we entered allegedly the community policing era. With the 1968 Kerner Commission report on civil disorders, the primary conclusion was that this country was divided into 2 societies, one black and one white, and those societies were separate and unequal. From the report, bad policing practices, a flawed justice system, unscrupulous consumer credit practices, poor or inadequate housing, high unemployment, voter suppression, and other culturally embedded forms of racial discrimination all converge to propel violent upheaval on the streets of African American neighborhoods in American cities, north, south, east, and west. And as Black unrest arose, inadequately trained police officers and the National Guard troops entered affected neighborhoods, often worsening the violence. That was written in 1968. We could just change the date on it. The report went to say, white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created the ghetto. White institutions maintain it. And white institutions condones it. The riots at that time represented a different kind of political activism, and they were, as the report indicates, commonly sparked by repressive and violent police actions. Urban uprisings were political acts of self-defense and racial liberation on a mass public scale. Legislative successes at the federal level with the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts were not reflected in the daily lives of African Americans facing police conduct, economic inequality, segregated housing, and inferior educations. That was 1968. What was happening then is happening now. And the murder of unarmed Black people has driven people into the streets in this time. I don't believe they will settle for anything less than a total restructuring of a very criminal justice system. We have to be prepared for some tough questions and prepare for some even tougher answers. It would seem that if people are protesting, asking for a more just society, the police ought to be on the side of the people walking with them and not positioned in opposition to them. If there is a more just society, then the job of the police officer would be easier. And so we have to ask, why is it that reforms don't seem to have a lasting effect on policing? Everything we have seen some folks took to the streets. The legislation that has been passed is just the tip of the iceberg. Think about it. Legislation has been passed to ban chokeholds, and they should be banned. However, it was not a chokehold that killed George Floyd. Banning chokeholds without bringing every single police officer in for untraining and then retraining sets each officer up for failure. There is something called muscle memory. And so you just can't put out a new policy and tell officers don't do that without bringing them in for untraining and retraining. And I remember when the bar hold was banned and we went to the carotid neck restraint. But if I had not been untrained to use that certain tactic called the bar hold, when the adrenaline is running, I and every other police officer will do what comes naturally, what we are used to doing. Plus, when we talk about banning chokeholds, many departments have already done that. They've been banned for 20 years. All reforms will fail until we deal with the ice below the surface, where there is systemic racism. And systemic racism, there are people who refuse to acknowledge that it exists. And why would they if it doesn't affect them? We would have to deal with the history of slave patrols, the control of Black bodies. And if we don't deal with those issues, reform will be temporary. I mean, we don't want to deal with the messiness. We want to identify the problem and move quickly to the solution without diagnosing, triaging, dealing with the history that has been omitted, the history that says that this country is not pure. It is not innocent. It is not great as we claim it to be. We don't want to deal with the messiness because we might just be implicated. We might just find ourselves complicit. We are going to have to deal with the truth, and the truth hurts. The truth tells what this country is all about. We must deal with systemic racism. That racism that sees the Black body as criminal, as suspect, as dangerous, and which must be eliminated either by segregation, incarceration, or extermination. As Danny Bell has said, when your weapon is your complexion, you're never unarmed. You're always armed and dangerous. Here we have 17-year-old in Kenosha who's just killed folks walking down the street with his automatic weapon, his hands raised. People are saying he just killed somebody, and the police ride on by. Earlier, they had even offered him water and thanked him for being there. We've got to change our way of thinking. And as Ella Baker, an early civil rights advocate, said, until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it happens. And so, as you prepare to become co leaders in this journey for justice, when this class is taught to police, we have to present a reason for why they should be in this course. Why are we bringing them off the street to sit in another training course? And so I ask you now to put yourselves in the mindset of a police officer participating in this training. And so we would offer them that these are the course goals: to provide a more complete picture of the creation and purpose of policing in America, to demonstrate how American policing developed and continues to be a tool to enforce racist values, to provide participants with information that shows a connection between the racist foundations and the founding of this country and the need for an agency to enforce the values and mores of this country. 3, to assist participants in determining whether or not policing contradicts or affirms their personal values concerning the sanctity of human life in all aspects. And so the learning goals, we would take them through this to discuss motivations for becoming a police officer and how the police culture can support or overcome those motivations, to critique beliefs from communities of color and how they affect police community interactions, to develop steps to assist police officers in partnering with the various communities they serve, to identify the formal and informal training that enables police officers of color to turn against their own people. And I give you a story. I was fresh out of the academy and I was riding with my training officer who was white, and we were patrolling a white part of town. And this was back in the ancient times when you didn't need a reason to stop someone. And so we would just stop people because basically we were bored of riding around. So the first 4 hours I sat in the shotgun seat. I was a passenger while my partner was driving, and he was stopping folks. And I wasn't really paying attention who he was stopping unless he needed some assistance. But when it came time for me to drive, I started stopping cars. And the first car I stopped was a red car. That's all I saw. It was a red car. And he asked me, "Why are you stopping that car?" And I said, "Because that's what we do." And he told me, "We don't stop white people." And I was taken aback because I asked him, I said, "Do you see who's sitting across from you? What do you mean we don't stop white people?" He said, "We don't stop white people." Well, when I was younger, I was a little bit more brash. And so for the remaining 2 of my duty, all I stopped was white people, just to tick him off. And so we have to be concerned about the informal training, learnings that our police officers undergo. And so we're going to look at this from the patrol officer's perspective, whether or not the true mission of American policing is in line with their beliefs, again, about the sanctity of life. We would begin with this training for the police, imagining you are the police officer and you have been sent to this training. We go back to the statements. We have to remember that the police are the enforcement arm of a racist society, and that the police are not change agents. They are to maintain the status quo. That's why when we ask the police departments to change, it doesn't stick, because that's not their job. They are to maintain the status quo. And if the status quo is a racist society, regardless of the reforms, regardless of the values of the police officer, regardless of what is going on, the police as an institution will reset to their true purpose, and the desire to change the police to ensure that all people are treated fairly gets lost in the shuffle, although it is important. And so we have to remind the police of that. The majority of police officers want to do what's right. They join for the right reasons. However, the police culture is strong, and if the police officer cannot resist its pull, that officer will find him or herself or themselves doing something that is totally against their nature. During the protests, early protests here in Washington, D.C., we had Officer Carlton Wilhot, who actually knelt with the protesters. They asked him to kneel. And he was interviewed, and he says, for me, kneeling was the right thing to do. At the end of the day, I'm black first. If I were to lose my job today or tomorrow, if I were to choose a different career path, one thing that would still remain when I take off this uniform is that I am a black man. And so this officer hosted a Zoom question and answer to take questions, to field questions about policing and how he handles the job because of some of the conflict that we see going on with the demonstrations. So remember, you are the officers, and this is going to be the introduction you would receive if we were doing this class for police. This class, it's not going to be easy. It's going to upset you. It will make you angry, but sometimes we have to go there to get the change that society requires. For those of you who will mumble and grumble underneath your breath, you are the officers the black community needs to be wary of. You'll probably go out in the hall during the breaks and complain, fuss, and cuss. You may even call me names, but it's okay because that means you probably should not be the police in the first place. Or it could mean that you have been infected with the virus that is American policing, and with proper inoculation, you can be healed. You've chosen to be part of this profession, and you need to have a much fuller knowledge of the history of policing in this country that is normally taught. As we have seen in recent protests, the black communities of color, will not tolerate being disrespected. They will not accept being abused. They will no longer accept having their lives destroyed by those who have sworn to serve and protect. And so after this introduction, as the instructor, as the facilitator, you would ask this question, particularly if there are black officers. As you stand face to face, toe to toe with black people who are fighting, protesting, calling for their right to encounter a police officer and not end up dead, what keeps you from putting down your baton, removing your battle gear, and joining them? Because you will find with this course that your skin will not protect you. Beginning after the riots of the 1960s, people who look like you, and women, Latinx, Asians, LGBTQIA folks were added to American policing in an attempt to change it. The thought was, if police departments just reflected, just looked like the communities they serve, policing would change, that the abuse would stop. And yet that change has not come. So what is the problem? And the question I ask you is, what keeps you from going over to the other side? There is a duty and burden on the black police officer. More and more officers are coming out, breaking that thin blue line and telling of their stories of discrimination at the hands of their fellow police officers. They are telling of racism in their own departments. Black police chiefs are finally admitting that policing has to change. Recently, black and brown members of the Prince George's County Police Department, the county just over from me, released a report that black and brown officers are twice as likely to have disciplinary charges sustained against them as white officers, and 3 times as likely to be terminated as those white officers. And former officers and current officers are suing the department for racial discrimination. A question you should ask your chief: have there been discrimination complaints or suits filed by black and brown officers, and what were the results? But sometimes, a lot of times, the police can be their own worst enemy. Not only are they recorded with cameras in the hands of the public, they are caught on their own cameras. And so I'm going to show you this video where a police officer stops a white female who is concerned about getting shot if she retrieves her ID. And the police officer says, "Remember, we only kill black people."
Now listen to me. Call the person who's coming to get you. Tell them they don't need to come. All right? Yes. Okay? So go ahead call them. I'm going to take you to jail, and I'm going to impound the car.
Before that, she needs to go to
No.
I can't call them if you don't open the door.
Why can't you?
Because I will not put my...
Use your phone. It's in your lap right there.
I just don't want to put my hands down. I'm really sorry. I'm just...
You just look at you wrong.
No. I've just been wasting any videos of problems.
But you're not black. Remember, we only kill black people. Yeah, we only kill black people, right? All the videos you've seen, have you seen white people get killed? You have.
An 18-year-old white boy gets hit 23 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
No, that's
Right.
So the question is, knowing that the dash cam is running, why would the officer make this statement? Why would the officer make that statement? Where did the officer learn that it was okay to do that? And then why was the woman concerned about retrieving her ID? You know, the National Association of Police Organizations, which represents about 241,000 of approximately 700,000 police officers in this country, has come out and endorsed the re-election of Donald Trump. I mean, how does that look? What are the optics for those who see Trump as a racist, a bigot, a nationalist, combined with the belief that the police are anti-black? I mean, this is the environment in which the police find themselves. But it is explainable, because if you only have one person who is lifting you up, you might gravitate to that person even though you don't agree with that person's views. And so this is the environment in which police officers are finding themselves. And then we go to this whole issue of race and how it is used and abused in our society. So before there was Central Park Karen and Barbecue Becky, there was Carolyn Bryant and Emmett Till, who was murdered in 1955, this month, a 14-year-old child, because he allegedly said hi baby to a white woman. How does Till's murder relate to the police? White women have falsely accused black men, which has led to murder, lynching, and beatings, with white men assuming an extralegal role. And so in recent cases, the police are used as a terrorist organization. How are the police perceived? Let me tell you of just one 2020 Emmett Till story, and there are so many more. Black men jailed, lynched, executed because of weaponized white women's tears. In 1976, Ronnie White, who was black, was 20 years old. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of raping 54-year-old Sarah Bust in Concord, North Carolina. She said Mr. White looked most familiar to the man who raped her. I mean, there was evidence that would have exonerated Mr. White, but the police and the prosecutor failed to provide it to the defense. The police lied on the stand. Mr. White was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to 2 life terms. His case was appealed by the Duke Innocence Project. However, the appeals court ruled that none of the hidden or lied about evidence would have changed the outcome of the original trial. And the court was right, but for the wrong reason. A black man convicted of raping a white woman, the case decided by an all-white, all-male jury. The decision had already been made. He was guilty. But now his case is being viewed and reviewed by the federal appeals court. We can only pray, and that while he is still waiting for that decision, the governor will commute his sentence. There are too many cases like this. But let's look at Central Park Karen. White people calling the police on black people because they can.
So there's an incident in New York Central Park caught on camera, and it's going viral. A black man, Christian Cooper, who is a bird watcher, recorded part of a dispute with a white woman. Her name is Amy Cooper, no relation. The whole thing is not captured on video, but it apparently began when he asked her to put her dog on a leash as required by park rules. They went back and forth, and then Amy Cooper claimed that she was scared. He then turned on his camera. She asked him to stop and then dial 911, telling the dispatcher that an African-American man was threatening her life.
Please stop. Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking pictures of calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in a ramble, and there is a man, African-American, who has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately. I'm in Central Park in the ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
Amy Cooper has apologized but was fired from her job. Joining me now is Kristen Cooper. We contacted Amy Cooper, by the way, last night, and she was invited on this show. She's invited on this show at any time. This is a...
So, my question here. What made Amy Cooper believe she could call the police and that they would respond? What was the least that could have happened to Mr. Cooper if the police had arrived and both were there? What was the most that could have happened and why? Where did she learn that she could call the police, plus add, an African-American man is threatening my dog and me, and believe that the police would respond? And so I'm going to ask you to put some answers in the chat. How did she think she could do this? Why did she think she could do this? And what was the least? What was the least that could have happened? What was the least and what was the most that could have happened to him had the police arrived and both were still there? So just put a couple of answers in the chat. And sometimes these things are difficult to deal with. I mean, she was taught that the police would protect her. And African-American, descriptions. The least would be handcuffs and a pat down. The most would be death, white privilege. The most is that Christian Cooper wouldn't be on that program because he would have been shot. The police exist to protect white citizens from threatening people, black people of color. She was brainwashed. She's ingrained. Multi-generational white privilege. Okay, I wonder if she didn't think that he would leave her if she called the police. And so this happens. And what we do know is that the police are tools, the system of policing, tools of a racialized society. And research has shown and continue to show that when our cities blow up, the police are usually at the epicenter because the people's voices have not been heard. The addition of police officers to police forces in the 60s and 70s was a direct result of how white officers over-policed in black communities. And yet those officers of color faced discrimination in those very departments where they were hired. And so in reality, American policing was the plantation overseers, and blacks were not in a position to be those overseers. Rather, they were like the black plantation trustees. They could only arrest blacks. They were assigned to patrol only black neighborhoods. They had to enter police stations early on through separate doors. They could not use the locker rooms. They could not ride in patrol cars. And some of those restrictions lasted up until the 1970s. And so we have the addition of black officers to policing today. We have black police chiefs, and yet the relationship between the police and black Americans was supposed to be better. And yet the incident that has galvanized the world has been this.
There are new developments in the death of George Floyd, the unarmed black man in Minneapolis who died in police custody. We're hearing from the paramedics who treated him. And now the mayor says he wants the police officer who pressed his knee to Floyd's neck to be prosecuted. CBS's Jeff Pegues reports tonight from Minneapolis.
The new cell phone video shows the initial arrest. Officers are seen taking George Floyd out of his vehicle. In surveillance video obtained by CBS News, a handcuffed Floyd is walked across the street toward a police car. In the distance, you can see Floyd fall. In this newly circulated video, 3 officers have Floyd pinned on the ground, while another stands over them. You can hear Floyd pleading for air.
Please let me stay here. I can't breathe, officer.
The officer who pressed his knee to Floyd's neck has been identified as Derek Chauvin.
Kill me, man.
He doesn't let up until the 46-year-old's listless body is put on a stretcher. In a new report, the fire department says medics in the ambulance checked his pulse several times, finding none. He was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Tonight, the other officers involved have been identified as Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kung, and Tu Tao.
So the question here, how do you do that to a human being? Former Officer Chauvin is oblivious to the life draining from Mr. Floyd. He ignores his pleas for help. How do you do that to a human being and not think you should not be held accountable? Because as you look at the picture of Officer Chauvin, he is not concerned. You can't do that if you're going to be held accountable for your actions. And the question is, I would just love 5 minutes with Officer Chauvin to ask if he believed that he killed, that he murdered a human being. And so where do officers learn that you can do that to a human being and not be held accountable?
There are new
In 1992, LAPD Chief Daryl Gates said that the beating of Rodney King was an aberration, but that was a lie. The aberration was that it was caught on camera. People of color are killed and abused by the police every single day in this country. The incidents just aren't caught on camera. As we are here in this webinar, it is happening. And so with this background for the officers, they would then be asked, why did they become a police officer? And those answers would be listed. And I can guarantee that you will not find one officer who says, I want to come and kill people, or I want to come and destroy people's lives. The majority of officers want to do the right thing. And so after the answers have been processed, then we would go to some of the things that people in the Black community face every day. And so after these motivations have been reviewed, we'd ask, how many of you have heard the conversation or the talk that Black parents have with their children? How many of you have had the talk with your children or have heard the talk from your parents? And the question would be, do you believe that this conversation is necessary? Why or why not?
We actually have a line that we do at our house. We practice this thing. What is it?
I'm Ariel Sky Williams. I'm 8 years old. I'm unarmed and I have nothing that will hurt you.
It's just kind of a thing we practice at our house. There are great police officers out there. There's also some police officers who are not so good.
And my fear is that you run across one of those bad ones.
For some reason, people of color have always been a target by the police.
Before they became a policeman, they were a person. And that person took all their ideas and all their thoughts and all their prejudice into their job.
Why would a police officer assume that you did something bad? Maybe because of my skin color.
I remember being put in handcuffs for something that had nothing to do with me. I was literally walking in the mall. Cops slammed me on the ground, busted my lip, chipped my tooth. That actually made me really mad.
How about the time they pulled us over with me in the car and arrested me and left all of you guys sitting in the car. Nobody knew how to drive on the side of the road because the bumper on the car was kind of hanging off.
No.
You know, we live in Puyallup. There's people that don't even have a bumper on their car.
My rear brake light wasn't working, and I got to my destination and they were working.
I was about your age. Actually, they grabbed me.
Why?
I didn't know at the time. They just grabbed me. They threw me onto the police car.
I got tased that time. That time they tased me because they said I wasn't complying.
Ariel, are you okay?
What's wrong, baby? I'm okay. I'm alive, all right? Every day I get to see you. I get to do this, right? All right, come on. Let's calm down. Let's finish this, all right? You good? Hey, you're making me cry. Come on.
You have to be careful when you're out there in this world because this world's not going to always be honest or fair to you. I know, Sean, you got a little bit lighter than the rest of them, so it's a possibility you won't get stopped.
Sound like you just pulled him over.
If you're driving, cop pulls you over.
Police gets out the car, comes to the window. What would you do?
License and registration, please, ma'am.
Why do you think I pulled you over?
I don't know, tell me.
When a police officer says something to you, you're black. You can't be looking at them saying, oh, I don't know, why don't you tell me?
Well, I mean,
that right there is giving them the license to pull you out of your car and physically harm you because it will be done.
Don't get upset. Don't get sassy. Why did you pull me over? You don't have. I know how. Just follow instructions and stay calm.
Okay. Do you think just being a police officer and pulling you over, regardless of if you feel you've done something or not, they should get your respect?
That's a tricky question.
The answer is yes.
Yes. If you got to go to your wallet to get your ID, say, can I go reach in my back pocket to get my ID out? You could do what I do, and I show them my hands. So when they're walking up, they see I don't have anything in my hands.
I'm Ariel Sky Williams, and I have nothing that will harm you or hurt you.
And what's the next place you put your hands when you're driving? Or on the steering wheel with your hands out?
If at all possible, turn your phone on.
And call someone and put it on speaker.
But whatever you're doing, I want you to say what you're doing before you do it.
You don't write any statements.
Well, you have to write a statement.
You don't have to write anything. You're a minor. I'm responsible for you. No one can tell you anything else.
If it tells you to be quiet, be quiet. Do everything that you can to get back to me. I see it weighing on you, and I don't want it to weigh on you. I'm just worried about Donovan. I'm worried about him now.
Who are you guys talking about?
My nephew and her cousin. I don't want him to be shot. I don't want him to go to jail.
You guys, if you could say anything to police, what would you say?
Learn about people. Learn about their problems.
Take some diversity training. I mean, it should be like at this point, like a monthly requirement.
You know, there's really nothing at this point that they could do that would make me feel any safer with them without them just point blank clearing them all out and starting all over from scratch.
So don't always assume that all of them are bad.
Mm-hmm. But all you see on the news and in newspapers, and it keeps happening. It's just in a different way. It's like how people are like, you should forgive so-and-so, but they keep doing it to me. I forgave them, but they keep doing it to me. It gets harder and harder to forgive them.
Wow.
We actually have.
So after the officers have reviewed this video, you would ask, how many of you have had the talk with your children? How many of you would want officers you work with to work in your community? How many of you would trust the officers you work with to know you in an encounter outside of work? How many of you have been stopped by the police? And then the thing is how much money do you think has been spent on police reform since 1970, and how could that money have been spent? And so the thing is that if black parents are having this conversation with your children, how does that affect the police officer's job? And so once you get them together and they're starting to analyze policing on their own, then you can move into the part of the training is how did we get so far from serve and protect to where parents have to teach their children how to survive an encounter with the police, because that's basically what it is. It's how to survive an encounter with someone who has sworn to serve and protect. And then we add, well, it depends on who you are, unless it was never about serving and protecting anyone other than white cisgender Christian, meaning white, people. And so we have to talk about where this policing system came from, and that the great evil of American slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude. It was the fiction that black people aren't as good as white people and aren't equals of white people and are less evolved, less capable, less worthy, less deserving than white people. And that was said by Bryan Stevenson, who has the lynching, who created the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, president and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. And then Eddie Glaude, in his book, Democracy in Black, calls this the value gap, that black people are viewed as less valuable than white people. They're expendable. We're expendable. And it doesn't matter how educated, how articulate, how traveled, you can keep on with the how. And Stephen has said that whites needed that to create a narrative of less than, to justify slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and continued discrimination. And so we have this history of violence against the black body where we use terror and intimidation and lynchings, and then Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, and then the police, and created this presumption of dangerousness and guilt, that black people are inherently dangerous and presumed guilty of something. I mean, how many? And we would ask this of the officers, particularly if they're officers of color. How many have been stopped by the police? How many have been followed in stores simply because you walked into a store? And Bryan Stevenson has said that we have created a culture where police officers think of themselves as warriors. Remember Dave Grossman's training and Nat Guardians, that they go to war, they protect the good white people from the scourge of the black and brown bodies. And that we still view the police as an occupying force, basically regardless of what color they are. And again, from James Baldwin. And the police are simply the hired enemies of this population. They are present to keep the Negro in his place and to protect white business interests. And they have no other function. They are, moreover, even in a country which makes the very grave error of equating ignorance with simplicity, quite stunningly ignorant of what is going on. And since they know that they are hated, they are always afraid one cannot possibly arrive at a more surefire formula for cruelty. And he wrote that in 1966 in the report from occupied territory. We hear it all the time. Black people are killed and we hear, I feared for my life. What were you fearing? There is a certain amount of fear that is protective. However, police officers cannot be scared, because to be scared is to invite danger. Now, you might disagree with all of these statements, but they didn't come out of the thin air. For all too many people of color, these statements are real. And when you, the police officer, remember you're in the role of the police officer, when you and they, the black community, interact, these statements, these beliefs provide a framework for the interaction. I don't know a black parent who has not had the talk with their children. And so we begin with the standard of the history of policing that every police officer gets who goes through a training academy. And believe it or not, there's still some folks that don't have a training academy, or they have to wait for a while before a training academy class starts, and they're out on the street policing with absolutely little or no information. And so the standard fare offered about the history of policing is based on Sir Robert Peel, that the police are the public and the public are the police. And these are very, very noble words. Every police recruit hears these words, introducing them to the profession they have chosen. Sir Robert Peel penned these words in 1829 to describe the Metropolitan Police Department of London. The police, he contended, were members of the community who were paid full time to do what all members of the community should have the responsibility for doing, but are either unwilling or unable to do it. And so this is also an issue with defunding or abolishing policing. Someone will come in to stand into the gap, but it won't be for long because, as we know with volunteers don't last always. So in this country, the police are members of the community from which they are drawn. However, a chasm has developed through the years, which has widened to the point where in all too many communities of color, the police are not seen as neighbors, but as invaders, as an occupying force, an enemy. As veteran law enforcement officials Sue Rare and Stephen K. Rice write, as a profession, we have veered away from Sir Robert Peel's ideal toward a culture and mindset more like warriors at war with the people they have sworn to serve and protect. We see police officers attired in battle dress uniforms, and federal monies have permitted police departments to purchase the armaments of war, tanks and armored personnel carriers to be driven on the streets of America. As our police forces look and act more like warriors at war, we are left to deal with the reality that war is about sending people to kill other people. And all too often, we have seen police kill unarmed people, people who pose no threat to the police. So what is the purpose of all of this? And I don't know about your grandma, but my grandma taught that you act the way you dress. And that's why we had school clothes, play clothes, church clothes, and dress clothes, because you acted differently. And so if you send people out looking like they're ready for battle, then all too often they look for a war.
New Hope police now have a new tool to help them fight crime and protect officers. But some have raised concerns about militarization of police departments. This week, the New Hope Police Department received this armored vehicle known as an MRAP from the U.S. Department of Defense. The city acquired the MRAP free of charge thanks to a program that provides law enforcement agencies with former military vehicles. New Hope spent about $65,000 to make the vehicle suitable for the needs of the police department.
As you know, police officers in today's world are asked to do more and more under more difficult situations than they ever have been before. And so the military recognizes this. Police administrators such as myself recognize that officers need as many tools in their toolbox as they can get. And this is an excellent tool.
The MRAP will primarily be used by the West Metro SWAT team that includes New Hope, Crystal, and Robbinsdale. The public can see it firsthand at the vehicle fair Saturday morning at the Crystal Community Center, which runs from 10 a.m. until noon.
We're going to take a break in about 5 minutes, take a stretch break, and then come back. This breach grounded in a lack of trust for the police, requires Black parents to have a talk with their children. And again, the conversation is not about how to respect authority. Rather, it's about how to survive an encounter with the police. The talk is required because they may encounter police who subconsciously review the Black and brown body as something less than human, dangerous, and therefore an alien threat. The Black body is a weapon, and the threat must be eliminated. There is a problem when yet another Black life, in the words of Mark Lamont Hill, is rendered nobody, not a thing, a nothing, by a jury's failure to hold police accountable for killing that body. And again, there is a problem when white men who are clearly armed and dangerous and violent can be taken alive by the police, while Black men and women whose only violation is driving with a broken taillight or allegedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill end up dead. So we're going to take a break right here, and then we're going to come back. And I want you to look at this, and some of you may have seen it, but I want you to look at this arrest of Dylan Roof and tell me what you see and tell me what you don't see. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. We will be back at 2:35, which gives us 7 minutes just to catch our breaths. So thank you for the time you spent already. And we will be back.
So I just got through weeping my way through this part, Gayle.
I tell you, you need prayer.
Yep. Dominique? I don't know if this is a counter for the. Is this counter for the break time?
Yes. Did she say 5 minutes?
Yes. So.
Yeah.
Yes, I put on a timer for the break.
Oh, okay. Well.
Unless you want me to take it off.
No, it's no problem. I just was trying to see what it was.
Yeah, trying to get a little innovative here.
Well, look at you.
The very powerful presentation.
Oh, I like the umbrellas.
Oh, thanks. Thank you for your patience, everyone. We will be resuming from our break momentarily.
This was the arrest of Dylan Roof. What did you see when the officers stopped the car and approached the car? You can put it in the chat. Okay. So Dominique, do I need to replay that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. Let me go back. So again, this is the arrest of Dylan Roof.
I'm so excited about that. I'm going to head over to Science on the Rocks first and check out their big guitar exhibit. Now is the time to buy a Chevrolet Buick. No one's going to make you a better deal. You can get a brand new 2015 Buick Enclave and save up to $6,000. $2,500 on the Buick Encore and selected models. Go see Matt and Cliff. They'll show you. McKinney Chevrolet Buick will save you thousands. See dealer for details. Check it out right now, McKinneyChevrolet.com. It's McKinney Buick, the area's lowest price Buick dealer, just off I-85 exit 22. Easy to find, easy to buy from. Experience the new Buick. Hey, it's Morgan at H.H. Greg's 3-day super sale. Get 0 down and 0 interest till January 2018. Up to 30% off. Greg's got it. Stainless steel French door refrigerator, only $9.99. And LG 55.
One of the imports came from Australia, that will be the first vehicle from the
Don't forget to download the H.H. Greg app to play daily games. HHGreg.com, available 24/7. Buy online, pick up in stores. Same.
Okay, so as you were looking at that, folks are standing back. They seem at ease. Now, we know this person, Dylan Roof, has murdered 9 people. Everybody knows that. These officers know that. And yet, they don't treat him as a threat or see that he's not resisting. If that, you're right, 9 black people were killed. Seems at ease. No sense of urgency, no language, no weapons. The person who actually goes up to get him out the car reholsters his weapon. Reholsters his weapon. So a white man who has murdered 9 black people is not seen as a threat. But a black man who goes around his car is shot 7 times in the back. Or as we saw with Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, he's walking down the street with an automatic weapon. He has just killed people. Folks are yelling, he just shot people. The police ask him, where are the hurt people? And pass him by, and then he goes up to the car. If you notice in that first film, he goes up to a police car and they tell him to get out of the street. So what is it? What is it about black people that is a threat just by living, just by breathing? And so as we look at what is going on, what has happened. When interviewed in the aftermath of the death of Freddie Gray by members of the Baltimore Police Department, Kelly Brown Douglas, who is the dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union, said the black body has always been viewed as suspicious, threatening, dangerous, a criminalized body. The black body was introduced into this country as a chattel body, as property, a body that was never meant to be free. When the black body was enslaved, there was no plan for future manumission. Freedom came to save this country. Black freedom was forced upon this country. Lincoln wanted to find another way, but he could not. He could not. And the only way was to end slavery. There were no other options to him. But if we think about it, slavery, that form of slavery, ended in 1865. That was only 35 years before the beginning of the 20th century. 35 years before the 20th century began. There was a possibility. If there had not been the abolitionist movement, if there had not been industrialization, that enslavement of black people could have entered the 20th century. And so what we find is that Kelly Brown Douglas's powerful statement identifies for many how the black body is viewed by white society and handled by the police as an internal enemy that must be watched and controlled. In this view, black bodies have the potential to turn and destroy the myths of white superiority and of the belief that American equals whiteness. The police as a domestic army is the arm of American society called to perform the task of controlling and eliminating that threat. A colleague of mine, Catherine Russell Brown, coined the term criminal black man stereotype. Criminal black man altogether stereotype. She coined this in 1996. Again, there is a presumption of guilt. There is a presumption of guilt. If you are black, you are guilty. You are guilty first and must prove your innocence, which is the reverse of how this justice system should work, that you're innocent and must be proven guilty. So there is this presumption of guilt, and gaining your freedom for the enslaved was considered a crime. And so black life had been criminalized. Gaining your freedom was considered a crime because the enslaved were property. And when that person left the plantation without the enslaver's permission, that property was stolen. What was legal for the enslaver, which was freedom, was not legal for the enslaved. And so at this part, we would have to go there with these officers, and people don't want to hear about slavery and how it evolved in this country. But the Africans who were brought to these shores in 1619 knew freedom. They knew a state of freedom that did not exist for them on these shores. Whites had to convince themselves that Africans were not capable of understanding freedom, that they did not have the intellect to understand the difference between freedom and enslavement. But those who have known freedom know when that freedom has been abridged, and it is human nature to attempt to return to a state of freedom. Whites knew this, despite their attempts to convince themselves otherwise, and that is why laws were enacted that punished Africans for attempting to secure their freedom by any means necessary. They were prohibited from learning how to read, lest they read and understand that the colonists used violence to overthrow their oppressor. Africans might be able to read the document that secured the colonists' freedom, the Declaration of Independence, which states, whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, that is freedom, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to all of them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Africans might have taken these words to heart and violently overthrown their oppressors, as did the colonists. Africans in America were prohibited from possessing firearms, the implements used by the colonists to secure their own freedom. Why is it that white males, militia, can be fully armed and on the State House Capitol steps and no one does a thing? But when the Black Panthers, who had a right to openly carry firearms to protect their neighborhood, the law came raining down on them, and that's where we got a lot of these laws prohibiting firearms for certain people. And so blacks were prohibited from meeting together, just in case Africans who had known freedom shared that information with the enslaved who were born in this country and had never known what it was to be free. The owners of the enslaved preferred blacks who were born in this country as opposed to Africans, because those who were born in this country had not known freedom. And so in an attempt to convince themselves that Africans were incapable of understanding freedom, whites used the language of oppression, which we will discuss later, and a corrupted view of the Bible to convince themselves that Africans were less than human and therefore incapable of understanding the rights of human beings that came from being created in the image of God. Ibram Kendi, who wrote Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, offers that if you're going to enslave and dehumanize other human beings, you have to justify why you are doing it. You have to create a narrative. Less than human, not intelligent, incapable of learning, incapable of living with civilized people, and then you can put your program into play. Yet these whites also knew that their exploitation and domination had bred an internal enemy that longed for freedom. And this domestic enemy had to be controlled lest it turn on them and destroy them. The internal enemy has taken to the streets. Thomas Jefferson described slavery as holding a wolf by the ears. The wolf could not be freed because it would turn and destroy the holder, and yet it could not be held forever because it would struggle and win its freedom, and when it gained that freedom, it would turn and destroy the one who had held it in bondage. This wolf, this internal enemy, had to be controlled by law and extra-legal means, including slave patrols. And so with the emancipation, the wolf was finally released. However, the previously enslaved could not be permitted to mix with white society for fear of discovering that perhaps they were equally human after all. Ever stronger laws were enacted to ensure the separation of the two races. Vigilantes and the police now maintain the separation through domestic terrorism and violence, and a criminal justice system that criminalized the simple act of being black. We have black codes, a system of law specifically for black people and nobody else. The recently freed were arrested for failure to maintain employment. I mean, think about it. You've just been freed. Where in the devil are you going to get a job? They were arrested for failure to properly spend their money if they were able to secure employment. But who makes that decision about another's money? They cannot stand together more than 3 on a street. Blacks still can't stand more than 3 without inviting white public and police suspicion. The police were the enforcement arm of Jim Crow and segregation laws. Have you ever wondered why the police could and can enforce discriminatory laws, but not laws that guarantee equality?
They came with horses. They came with nightsticks. And I was standing and people were running because they were beating me. I did not run, so he hit me at the base of my neck. And I became unconscious.
Photos of a woman tear-gassed and beaten unconscious by Alabama state troopers are among the most iconic images of the civil rights movement. The woman was Amelia Boynton Robinson, a leader of the campaign for black voting rights in Selma, Alabama, and the first black woman to seek a seat in the US Congress from that state. She had helped organize a demonstration on March 7, 1965, to protest the killing of a young African-American church deacon named Jimmy Lee Jackson by an Alabama state trooper, and to continue the fight for voting rights. The Selma establishment was known to be among the most egregious in barring blacks from the polls. But what started as a peaceful protest ended with unspeakable violence. The veteran activist clearly recalls the events of that day, and she recently recounted them to middle school students in Los Angeles.
Under Dr. King, we decided that what we need to do is to have a bill that would let Negroes become registered voters. We were going to march from Selma, Alabama, which is on the river bridge, to Montgomery. I was near the front at the beginning. They came with horses. They came with nightsticks. And I was standing and people were running because they were beating me. And then he hit me on my shoulder. I did not run, so he hit me at the base of my neck. And I became unconscious. They drugged me off of the highway. And there I lay. I don't know how long. But somebody said to one of the state troopers, "She's dead." So they reported it to Jim Clark, who was the sheriff. And he said, if she's dead, let her alone and let the bus sleep.
Images of the atrocities that day sparked shock and outrage across the globe. When Boynton Robinson became aware of the magnitude of the malfeasance that occurred on Bloody Sunday, it intensified her resolve.
So it made my determination to do better and go farther.
Boynton Robinson was present at the White House when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law in August 1965. The episode became known as Bloody Sunday. It sparked worldwide outrage and helped garner support for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As the 50th anniversary of the event approaches on March 7th, Boynton Robinson is not bitter. Instead, she remains resolute in her belief that although she almost died fighting for freedom, the struggle was worthwhile.
After Bloody Sunday, people began to wake up, and those who have arisen because of our Bloody Sunday, they have excelled.
Despite her age, Boynton Robinson's activism is far from done. The matriarch of the civil rights movement believes there is still a long way to go. She appealed to today's generation to embrace the lessons of the struggle and not take their vote for granted.
And I am still determined that these young people will realize that a voteless people is a hopeless people. If we don't register and don't fight for your rights, then we are hopeless, whether it's an individual or a group of people. You are no citizen at all.
So, all of that because black people said we have a right to vote. We've heard coming from the White House that on election day that there might be police and sheriffs at the polls. That's a threat. That is to scare. And so this internal enemy that dared fight for its rights, the freed wolf, still exists in America. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 promised freedom. However, that black body, as Kelly Brown Douglas reminds us, is not still totally free. All too many black Americans continue to have their life chances limited because of skin color. They are kept out of the housing market because of redlining. They are trapped in underperforming and under-resourced schools. They suffer voter disenfranchisement. At any moment, with the slightest provocation, from looking at a police officer in the eye to walking too fast to exhibiting so-called furtive movements or changing lanes without signaling, the black body in America can find itself stopped and frisked, incarcerated on trumped-up charges, or lying dead in the street. In Tears, We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America, Michael Eric Dyson writes, "They, the police, hide behind the state to justify killing us. They say we are scary, that they are afraid for their lives. They say this even when we have nothing in our hands but air. They say this even when they are armed with weapons meant to remove us from the face of the earth. They say this even when they must throw down guns to pretend that we intended to do them harm. They say this even when video proves they are lying through their teeth." And so we take this group of police officers and say that it is time to repair the breach and stop bandaging the wounds before the police lose what little legitimacy they have. And that will make the police officer's job even more difficult. With each jury acquittal that fails to hold police accountable for dealing death to black bodies, the breach is widened and salt is poured into the wound. Yet the question remains, how do we lift up Sir Robert Peel's description of the police and the community? Because the police are our neighbors, they are members of our families, they are our congregation members, and they are our ministers, and they are our preachers. Answering that question is important to the future of our nation. Why is it that when a police officer is killed, the community is there ready to offer solace and support? However, when a civilian is killed by the police and there are vigils and funerals, the police tend not to reciprocate. The community understands that the police and the community are part of the same whole, a fact that seems to be lost on the police. And so we go back to the Declaration of Independence, where it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends of happiness and freedom, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. And so when people talk about abolishing the police, reforming the police, taking things into their hand, they have a right to do it. There are people who want to abolish the police. And what happens if the police are abolished? What system can be used to replace them? Or should the police, if they have come to be known, be modified or reformed? And so we talk about defunding, reforming, abolishing. To reform, the reforms have not worked, because the police are not change agents. Defunding is scary to a whole lot of folks because they think that if you defund, oh man, their communities, as was said the other night on the Republican National Convention, oh, their communities will be overrun. And so you need the language to understand what defunding means. Defunding means that what we do is look at what the police do and what they're called to do and what they're not capable of doing but are called to do anyway. And that we take those things, those tasks that they're not trained to do or should not be doing, and give them to the organizations that have responsibility for that, and take that money, the requisite money, and transfer it with them. But those organizations have to be up and running and willing to operate 24/7, or it will come back to the police. You can't do as it was done in Seattle, just take $20 million from a police budget and not take $20 million of tasks and services and calls with it, because then you're asking the police to do the same thing as before without the money. And so, do we reform? Do we reform? Do we abolish? And when we talk about abolition, that's not saying that you will not have police. What it does say is that we will abolish the police as they were created and continue to act, and put in place policing that works for the communities. And then as we get to this point, we want to start showing videos that have some hope and some promise. And so with this particular video that we're going to see is called Walking While Black. Love is the answer. And with all these Episcopalians on, I know that love is the answer just drives the point home. And this video critiques the police and provides answers to repairing the breach. And from the press release, it says, instances of racial profiling plague minority communities on a daily basis. And so the person who put this together, A.J. Ali, is no stranger to the phenomenon. When he and his wife were targeted by harassment by police numerous times in Howard County, Maryland, he was forced to take a stand. And though his attempts at achieving justice through channels offered by community organizations often went unrewarded, he refused to let go of that dream, that a solution to the problem could be found. And he went on a quest for truth and reconciliation, which led him to find living examples of love in action. And we're always asking, going, what does love look like? Well, he's found some examples. And so more than 4 years in the making, Walking While Black, LOVE, is the answer, presents proven steps to bridge the painful gap between peace officers and the community they serve. And LOVE is an acronym for Learn About the People and the Community in It. Open your heart to the humanity of people in the community. Volunteer yourself to be part of the solution, and then empower others to do the same. So I am going to
I'm looking at him and he's scared. He's scared of me. I see kids when they see me in uniform go out their way just to say to the top of their lungs, I hate the police! Can't stand the police! They used to love us. What happened? I heard a bullhorn and it said, pull over.
And the first thing out of their mouth was,
What are you doing here? What are you doing here?
what are you doing here? I said, excuse me?
I said, why did you stop me? And he said, because we're stopping anyone who looks like they're not from this neighborhood.
Racial profiling is so dangerous because we dehumanize each other.
Quite a bit of what we worry about today when we talk about bias has to do with perception. People have looked at African Americans as being stronger, more violent.
So the enemy uniform became the color of someone's skin.
I walk the streets of my own neighborhood, and I'm chased and hounded, persecuted, and guns drawn on me.
You know, men and women feeling the need to kill somebody because they frightened them is outrageous. You don't get to just shoot them in the back.
We asked kids what are some of the sounds of spring, and they said gunfire. And there's a lot of pain going on out there. People like that take it on themselves.
The problem is, most have learned to coexist with that trauma and do it poorly.
To think that so many people in the minority communities have an added fear. And we're supposed to be the good guys. We're supposed to be the ones that make you not fear.
Right now, the fire is within the African American community, not just the police officers.
There's a problem here.
This is a battle for our identity.
Change is going to come from within.
We've got to start seeing each other as a value and as an asset.
Love covers a multitude of things.
Love is the answer.
It's a possibility now for healing to actually occur.
The relief comes from relationship. I have to love you and value your life enough to make a difference.
It's about being able to put in the work, even when you don't want to.
Absent of love, we have chaos. Absent of love, we have nothing.
Who are we going to become as a society?
The next doctor that would cure cancer could have their life cut short.
Wouldn't you say it's kind of suspicious to travel under the speed limit when the speed limit is 70? Morning. How are you, sir? Deputy Snell with the Sampson County Sheriff's Office. You got your license and registration on you? I do.
Okay.
All right, may I ask what the stop is for, sir? I'll let you know as soon as you.
You're not supposed to
give me your
see
ID.
one. I have to get that one off the, hold on. Hold on a minute. Okay, so now I got it. Thank you. Okay, so how did we get here? We continue this discussion and we look at history. We bring up James Baldwin, but what we are truly looking at as we deal this is that we have to deal with systemic racism. And so far, all of the approaches that we have put in place gloss over systemic racism. And the problem of racism in this country is to, we want to improve the relationship between African Americans and the police have not been successful. And all too often, police and community and the rest of the world believe that somehow we are post-racial. But that is a lie. We are not post-racial because race still continues to define the lives of too many people in this country. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said that the sin of slavery was paid for by the election of President Obama. Again, racism doesn't affect you if race does not prescribe every aspect of life. And so police reform has been discussed and tried since the beginning of the 20th century, and more than 100 years later, we're still having a half-hearted conversation. Courses on race relations and now implicit bias have been part of police training since the late 1960s. And the jury is still out on the effectiveness of community policing to positively affect the outcomes of interactions in the police and people of color. And so we've had these during the 60s. We had race relations, racial sensitivity training, cultural diversity. We have gone through the alphabet with the training. And originally the training was to provide police officers with information about the people they were supposed to serve. And then recognizing that that didn't work, then we went to implicit bias, which says that it's something that you bring, the police officer brings to the job that is a problem. And so now, rather than this being information about people in the community, it's all the police officer's fault. That if you didn't bring these attitudes and perceptions, your job would not be as difficult as it is. And so police violence is nothing new. Today, anyone can be charged with contempt of cop, e.g., for example, disorderly conduct, if the police officer believes that he or she is not being given proper respect. And so we live in a country where police violence is a daily fact of life, and for too long, black and brown bodies have been violated by police officers without public accountability or valid explanation, and that's why you as police officers are in this class. The availability of cell phones and video recordings shared on the internet has brought the issue of state-sanctioned police violence to the forefront of public awareness. Clearly, how the police interact with people of color must be addressed, and failure to do so will lead to more protests and more deaths of police officers by those who feel that their grievances are not being taken seriously. And so in the review of the Baltimore Police Department in the aftermath by the police killing of Freddie Gray, the Department of Justice found that police officers believed that they had a right to arrest people whom they perceived to be disrespectful or insolent, and that these officers would retaliate for this lack of respect through the use of excessive force. This is what the Department of Justice found when they rode around in the cars with the police officers. But what we do know is that no policy, procedure, special or general order, or consent decree will bring changes to policing until the cancer within the police culture that is the result of white America's attempt to control its internal enemy is acknowledged. Until there is confession, there can be no true reform, and community policing will not become a reality until white America's stained and strained relationship with Black Americans is laid bare. But I want to tell you, as police officers, American policing is an aphrodisiac. It is a bait and switch, in that it lures, it seduces, it radicalizes those who enter wanting to serve and protect through socialization and training. It holds unleashed power to affect the lives of America's citizens, its residents, and its visitors. The strong force of the police culture is able to overcome the natural empathy of human beings that makes it difficult to do violence to others. You remember the incident in Baltimore when the 75-year-old man was pushed to the ground by an officer, and another officer tried to stop to assist, but he was pushed to continue walking and not assist. This culture dehumanizes as a protective factor for the police officer, so that the principles of morality, thou shalt not kill, no longer apply, and moral restraints are overcome. How do you see a man who is bleeding and not give aid? If others are not truly human, not like us, but rather are criminals, perps, scum, trash, dirtbags, then their bodies can be violated without moral reservations getting in the way. I mean, their non-human status justifies violent treatment. And then you might ask, but the man in Buffalo was white. He wasn't Black. Yes, the police culture can make you turn against your own if they are turned into the enemy. So the continued study of the police, and it has to be continuous study, will lead us to conclude that policing reflects the society that gave it birth, and that the police are both a product of society and also heavily dependent on the values and laws of those in control. And so we must also remember that the police are not change agents. We have to constantly remind ourselves that police are not change agents. That is why it is difficult for community policing to take hold, particularly in communities of color. The police are to maintain the status quo of society, and a society that holds negative beliefs and opinions about people of color will see those values played out in how the police relate to people of color. Historical negative opinions and stereotypes of, in particular, Black males as dangerous, suspicious, criminal, worthless, in need of being controlled, and guilty until proven innocent tend to be the rule in American society rather than the exception. It is a culture that views Black people in white communities as out of place. If Black people and other people of color can occupy the same space as whites, then they must be equal. They must be the same. And that defeats, that contradicts the premise, the narrative, the belief of white supremacy. In a YouTube interview with retired NYPD officers, one former detective states, would I stop 4 or 5 Black guys who are in a white neighborhood? Yeah, if they're not supposed to be there. What constitutes anyone that's supposed to be in any given neighborhood in America? Being out of place, what David Delaney calls the geopolitics of race, can be justification enough to take the lives of black people in America. Trayvon Martin was murdered because George Zimmerman determined that Trayvon did not belong in the gated community where, in fact, his father lived. And in another video, several NYPD officers confessed, "We are the predator. They are the prey." These officers offered, as they crossed the thin blue line, to confess that when the police need rest to make quotas that are not said to exist, quotas don't exist. They go to the most vulnerable, the blacks, the LGBT, and the poor. I was on another webinar with a black Episcopal priest and talking about the same issues, and he talked about how the day before that webinar he had gone to a protest. And so on his way back from the protest to his home, which he admits is a gated community, he was behind two other cars, but in those two other cars were white folks, and he saw the officer, the security officer who is assigned to that position, just wave them through. You know, he looked and then waved them through. But when this black priest who lived in that community got to the gate, he was asked for identification. And do you live here? And so my priest friend said, "Why are you asking me this? I live here." And he was told, "Well, it doesn't look like you belong here, so I have to make sure before I let you through." And so he was talking and he was shocked. And I said, "Well, you just got a little bit of what it means not to be able to go anywhere in this country that you don't belong in your own neighborhood." And so all of this is known and has been known about American policing for some time, and still, you know, there's hesitancy to acknowledge its underpinnings and the deleterious effect that foundation has on police community relations. In 2006, Jack Green wrote, "Local law enforcement agencies must be more creative and aggressive in their attempts to repair the damage done by slavery, discrimination, and past and current police practices supporting systems of racially and or ethnically based oppression and exploitation." Don Santarelli, the author of the federal no-knock raid, has described this broken relationship as beyond repair. When you speak to a police officer today, you're terrified that you're going to offend him and he's going to arrest you or take you off to jail, that there's no accountability for excessive force. And yet, if there's any hope to repair the breach, we must begin with the belief that the relationship is not broken beyond repair. Because if we accept that there is no hope, the relationship will continue to deteriorate, with the result being more deaths on both sides, and no one, not even whites, will be safe. Both the community and the police must understand the development of modern policing, and that modern policing was tied to the economic interest of America, and not as a mantra to serve and protect would have us believe that the police were here to serve all. And so as we continue this history with officers, you know, we talk about how police departments came into being and when they came into being. And so as the economic structures of the country developed in the 1800s, the informal law enforcement structures in place prior to that time developed into centralized municipal police departments by the mid-1800s. Boston was the first to establish a modern police force in 1838, followed by New York City in 1845, Charleston, South Carolina in 1846, Albany, Chicago, New Orleans, and the major places by the 1850s. The Charleston Police Department was formed when its city guard, which had been formed to control its enslaved population, was changed to the city police. And so what do you notice about the dates? They were all created during slavery. And so when we project the 21st century understanding on what the police should do, on the early police, it would be easy to assume that the police of the 19th century were formed to prevent crime and to serve and protect American citizenry. But in fact, as historian and Professor Sam Mitrani reminds us, they were not in fact created to serve and protect, nor were they created to stop or prevent crime or to promote justice. Rather, they were created to serve the needs of the wealthy elite by protecting their property and business interests. For this reason, the development of police forces took similar but slightly different directions in the North and the South. In the North, the movement towards centralized policing was necessitated by urbanization, as people left farms and rural areas to reside in cities and seek employment there. The increase in the number of people living in cities required a more formal way of keeping order. And the traditional forms of control, the watches, constables, sheriffs, proved inadequate to maintain profitability and ensure that the workforce would not undermine capitalist interest. An organized system of social control was needed. The threat to social control was now the wage earner, the person who went to work every day, who worked in dangerous and exploitative conditions. And the capitalists wanted to stem the tide of discontent. They wanted to tamp down strikes. And so there was also white mob violence against new immigrants, immigrants from Eastern Europe, and freed blacks. Conflicts between the haves and the have-nots resulted in major strikes and riots in cities such as Chicago, where the police attacked strikers with extreme violence. Unionization was seen as a threat, and the modern police department provided an organized, centralized body of men legally authorized to use force to maintain order, to prevent labor strikes. And so in the aftermath of these clashes, where the police were on the side of the political and economic elite, we still see this today when there are protests on whose side are the police. The police presented themselves as a thin blue line protecting civilization, the interests of the wealthy elite from the disorder of the so-called dangerous class, the working class, the immigrants, and people of color. The underclass needed to be watched and controlled lest they cause havoc to business interests, capitalism, and legal violence. Brutal and deadly force was used by the police to maintain order. You know, we saw this in D.C. at St. John, in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. The president wanted to make a little trip over so he could hold up the Bible, and you see him walking through flanks of the police. I guess they are protecting him from the peaceful protesters that they used tear gas on, but they were seen as the dangerous classes. And so in the South, it's a little bit different. The police enforced white supremacy and white hegemony, and before emancipation, maintained order by hunting down and returning the escaped slaves, ensuring that insurrections and other violence toward the white planter was tamped down. We heard that the president, in the current civil disorders, was going to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807. The Insurrection Act of 1807 was specifically to prevent slave insurrections. So the past caught up with the present. And then after emancipation, the police arrested black people on largely trumped up charges such as vagrancy, unemployment, preaching the gospel without a license, and other alleged misdemeanors and felonies to feed into the convict lease system. The emancipation of the enslaved did not eliminate the need for free labor. And the police were the means to feed a steady supply of black bodies into an economic system that had been built on the blacks of the enslaved. The police then and now were the gatekeepers to an unjust criminal justice system. And if you believe that the convict lease system has ended, I recommend that you watch Anna DuVernay's documentary 13th. which shows how, as Brian Stevens has said, slavery has not ended, it has just evolved. And so what began in the 1800s as a means of control and maintaining order among the enslaved and free blacks in the South and a way to protect capitalist interests from the dangerous classes, the new immigrants and wage earners in the North, ultimately created a focus on crime control that persists today, the idea that policing should be directed toward bad individuals rather than addressing the social and economic conditions that encourage and permit crime. But it is mostly disorder. It is mostly disorder we are talking about. Majority of the calls for service have little to do with crime as we have defined it. But the vestiges of discriminatory and unconstitutional policing continue today, with Black and brown bodies disproportionately affected and subjected to heightened surveillance for a potential criminal act. More than 150 years after emancipation, a young Black man making eye contact with police can still be regarded as a sign of guilt, an act of disrespect, and an affront to state power. According to Mark Lamont Hill, this presumption of guilt, described by Harvard law professor Charles Ogletree, has always been the governing logic for white officers engaging Black men and women in America. In America, the Black body is presumed guilty until proven innocent, and all too often, innocence is determined after death. And so you've been teaching the officers, or you've been part of this class and you're presenting this. You might be taking this and presenting it to your faith community or another community organization. And after this section has been provided, you ask the question, what did you hear that was different from what you've heard about the beginnings of policing and the history of policing in America? And you can return to the video, the love video, where the president, if you get the entire video, where the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, admits that policing has been part and parcel of America's racialized and discriminatory history. So why is it so easy for the police to enforce discriminatory and unjust laws rather than laws that ensure a just society? These attitudes still exist. Let us not fool ourselves, and they are based in history.
And separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
In May of 1963, one individual in Birmingham, Alabama, reinvigorated the wilting civil rights movement. Bull Connor, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, ordered the use of fire hoses and police dogs to quell demonstrations pushing for desegregation in Birmingham. In an ironic twist, however, by defending segregation so fervently, Bull Connor actually called national attention to the civil rights movement and dramatized its goals. His violent actions brought the immediate end to segregation in Birmingham, solidified his legacy as a symbol of bigotry, and, most importantly, hastened the passage of major civil rights legislation. Starting in the 1950s, dramatic changes began to sweep the entire nation. Following the landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the success of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, America found itself amidst an ever-strengthening civil rights movement. In 1962, however, the movement met its first significant setback in Albany, Georgia. The Albany movement was largely a failure. Because it lacked a clear-cut focus and failed to arouse an aggressive response from the police department, the campaign stalled. In August of 1962, the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., left the city of Albany. According to King, the Albany movement's aims were so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left depressed and in despair. Although King left Albany crestfallen, he quickly refocused his attention on finding a way to regain momentum. King and other civil rights leaders sought someone that would display to the world the grim reality of segregation in the South. It didn't take long to find such an individual. Born in 1897, Theophilus Eugene Connor achieved local fame in Birmingham after dropping out of high school and becoming a baseball radio announcer in 1921. Due to his booming voice, Connor earned the nickname Bull, and eventually became, according to one publication, one of Dixie's most popular announcers. In 1934, Bull Connor launched his career in politics by becoming a member of the Alabama House of Representatives. According to Connor, he ran partly for the fun of it and partly to see how many friends I had. Despite his superficial motives and modest beginnings, Connor eventually would become one of the most infamous men in the South. By 1963, Connor had already gained his reputation for defending segregation at all costs. Over the past 2 decades, he had dominated Birmingham's political scene. Serving as the Commissioner of Public Safety, Connor controlled both the police department and the fire department. Connor frequently used his power to enforce Birmingham's stringent segregation ordinances, or, as he referred to them, our way of life. Bull Connor's Birmingham had become an international symbol of segregation and racism. The city was referred to as Bombingham for the numerous unsolved bombings by the Ku Klux Klan during Connor's reign. In 1962, Connor ordered the closure of over 60 of Birmingham's parks rather than follow a court's order to desegregate public facilities. According to Dr. King, Birmingham was the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. After the failure of the Albany movement, local civil rights leaders implored Dr. King to make Birmingham the next target of the civil rights movement. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth told King, "If you come to Birmingham, the movement can not only gain prestige, it can really shake the country." With such a strong incentive, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began planning for the campaign in Birmingham. It would be called Project C, for confrontation.
I have the feeling that if we can get a breakthrough in Birmingham and really break down the walls of segregation, it will demonstrate to the whole South, at least the hardcore South, that it can no longer resist integration.
Since African Americans comprise 40% of the consumer population in Birmingham, the SCLC decided to target segregation primarily in the business section of the city through economic boycott and prolonged demonstrations. The leaders of Project C also hoped that it would serve as a template for future resistances in southern cities. According to Shuttlesworth, we wanted confrontation, nonviolent confrontation, to see if it would work on a massive scale, not just for Birmingham, for the nation. After small-scale demonstrations in April, the leaders of Project C decided to use a revolutionary new tactic. The final phase of the movement would focus on mobilizing hundreds of Birmingham's youth. On Thursday, May 2nd, the first children began demonstrating. By the end of the day, Bull Connor and his police force had arrested 959 children, ranging from ages 6 to 18. Over the next few days, Connor continued defending segregation at all costs.
Do you think you can keep Birmingham in the present situation of segregation?
I may not be able to do it, but I'll die trying.
Connor ordered his police and fire departments to use dogs and hoses to crush these massive demonstrations. To counter King's tactic of nonviolence, Connor pledged to fill the jails. By May 7th, Connor and his police department had already jailed over 3,000 demonstrators. The situation in Birmingham worsened as Connor proceeded with his relentless attack on the demonstrators. Local business leaders began to change their minds about segregation. Because of the economically crippling effect of the boycott and the state of race relations, the Senior Citizens Committee, a group that represented the majority of Birmingham's businesses, agreed to desegregate lunch counters and hire African American workers. Announced on May 10th, the Birmingham Agreement struck an enormous blow for integration. Bull Connor's extreme actions had clearly backfired, but his violent actions would eventually backfire even more.
Bull Connor's recalcitrant behavior and positions allowed the press to be able to focus thoroughly on what was happening within a movement experience.
Over 200 reporters from local and national media outlets captured Connor's segregationist tactics in pictures and video. The stark contrast of vicious dogs and high-powered hoses with young children dramatically stirred the nation's conscience. As Connor attacked the Birmingham Agreement as capitulation by certain weak-kneed white people, President John F. Kennedy began preparing for a monumental address to the nation. Previously, Kennedy had taken a rather lackluster stance on civil rights for African Americans. However, Bull Connor's alarming actions in Birmingham had alerted Kennedy, along with millions of other Americans, of the dire situation in the South. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy delivered an address on civil rights to the nation.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Using the momentum from the events in Birmingham, over 250,000 Americans participated in the March on Washington in August of 1963, rallying behind a cry to pass the bill. A year later, President Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act, which was originally proposed because of Bull Connor's aggressive defense of segregation, outlawed segregation in schools, public places, and employment, and was an enormous step towards equality between different races. On March 10, 1973, Eugene Bull Connor died. By this time, Connor had lost nearly all of his political power and remained in the minds of Americans as a racist leader in the South. But for the civil rights movement, Connor was so much more than that. Connor became the quintessential representation of racism and prejudice in the South. By pledging to defend segregation at all costs, Connor was the perfect individual around whom the civil rights movement could rally. His attention-grabbing actions were of the utmost of importance for the movement. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Connor's use of fire hoses and police dogs on demonstrators not only caused the immediate end of segregation in Birmingham, but also triggered a sequence of events, from Kennedy's proposal of a major civil rights bill to the March on Washington, that directly led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Connor's story demonstrates how one individual's actions have the power to influence popular opinion and call attention to inequalities in our world. After Connor's downfall, one periodical discussed his influence in Birmingham. Without Bull dominating the Birmingham scene, race relations in the city would have been far in advance of what they are, for in season and out he gave encouragement, aid, and comfort to the intellectually prehistoric mass mobs who have shot, bombed, and persecuted Negro citizens in an effort to thwart their advance to full manhood status. What this author could not understand, however, was just how crucial Connor's role was in advancing race relations in not only Birmingham, but in the whole nation. Connor has been called the perfect adversary, because he embodied all of the ugliness of segregation in the hardcore South. Pictures of his racist actions alerted the nation of the inequality in everyday life in the South and led to an unanticipated revival in the previously wilting civil rights movement. Reflecting back on the events in Birmingham, President Kennedy remarked on the importance of Connor in the civil rights movement. He said, "The civil rights movement should thank God for Bull Connor. He's helped it as much as Abraham Lincoln."
So, again, these attitudes still exist. And don't think that everyone wants the police to change. Don't think that everyone wants American society to be one of equality. Let's not fool ourselves. And tomorrow, 57 years after the original March on Washington, there will be people on the mall here with the same demands. And one of them is the end to police brutality. And so as you have brought the officers up to this point through the history of policing, or you have shared it within your communities, you take the officers next, you take the people, the participants next to what's called the language of oppression. Because all of this, to denigrate, to dehumanize people, you have to get yourself to realize that they are not like you, not human. And so policing, like other professions or occupations, has its own set of values and traditions. It also has its own argot or language. Unfortunately, it is a language that dehumanizes people. And as we continue to dissect the culture of policing, it is important to study that language and how it desensitizes police officers to the humanity of those they have sworn to serve and protect. And so what would happen now in a classroom setting, you divide folks into groups and have them answer the question, how do these terms that are on the slide, how do these terms negate the humanity of people? Because we saw in the film how Black people were called. And what is interesting, when the Nazis were trying to figure out their final solution, how to deal with the Jews and the Romanis and the disabled, they looked to America as the template of how to dehumanize people. America's relationship with its Black people became the playbook for the Nazis. And so the language of oppression is destructive. For the language of oppression to work, there must be a comparison made between one group and another. One group must be lifted up as the perfect standard. And in America, that perfect standard is the white body. This country is based on the myth that it is a Christian nation. However, that is a false belief that helps in the dehumanization of non-white bodies. If white bodies are more godlike and are closer to God, the Black body and other non-white bodies can be viewed as closer to animals, not reflecting God. Once whites deny the humanity of non-whites, they can be viewed as a different species, as savages and likened to apes. When defined as animals, it is not difficult to treat and transport them as animals. Thomas Jefferson's ideas that Blacks were closer to orangutans than to humans has survived for centuries. The president, the former president, Obama, and the First Lady throughout were referred to as apes. In 2016, Pamela Ramsey Taylor, a municipal officer in Clay, West Virginia, was removed from her position, although she was later restated because she referred on Facebook to Mrs. Obama as an ape in heels. The ability to dehumanize through the language of oppression weakens inhibitions against behaving cruelly toward other human beings and allows the moral disengagement that is necessary to shield whites from the moral failure of not viewing all humans as being made in the image of God or even worthy of respect if folks don't believe in God. When describing the police officers who controlled his community called Union, a 27-year-old Black man from Ferguson, Missouri said, "It's not like we're even human to them." Darren Wilson, the Ferguson police officer who killed Michael Brown, said that he saw a demon coming toward him. How does a human being turn into a demon that must be killed? The police have also been drawn into using the language of oppression by imagining African Americans as animals and even predators. A feeling of horror is evoked that can only subside when the threat is eliminated. In 1995, the political scientist John Diallo Jr. warned of the coming epidemic of juvenile super predators, radically impulsive, brutally remorseless youngsters who murder, assault, rape, rob, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, join gun-toting gangs, and create serious communal disorder. These fatherless, godless, and jobless children, Diallo explained, could mostly be found in minority and urban communities. Throughout this country, as workshops on community policing were being offered in the 1990s rather, Diallo's prediction was often held up as fact. And when these murderous Black hordes failed to materialize, he came to regret his predictions. Still, the damage had been done. And it was all too easy for many white Americans to believe this depiction of Black males as animals, as predators who prey on white America. Blacks are considered as disposable, and they must be destroyed to secure the safety of white America. Having grown up in a society that viewed blacks as less than human, coupled with the police culture that traditionally has viewed blacks as innately dangerous and guilty, it could be offered that police officers who torture black and brown bodies they are called to serve and protect are as much victims of a racialized American culture as those who lie mutilated and dead in our streets. There are victims on both sides of the breach. And I don't know if you watched the RNC the other night, but there was a woman by the name of, I think it was Amy Johnson. She was a white woman. And she spoke about one household, one vote, trying to send everybody back to the Stone Ages. But there's also an article about her. Apparently she adopted a biracial child, a boy. And she says that she understands and expects her biracial child to be profiled by the police because he is half black, because of the preponderance of the overrepresentation of black males in the criminal justice system. She expects that, and she has forced that attitude onto her sons. And she said, that's not going to happen to my nerdy white kids. But my black child, oh yes, we expect him to be stopped by the police. We expect him to be profiled because the data show that he is, and she said that he is more likely to commit a crime than her white children. So that's a mother who is traumatizing her own son. Okay. And so as we continue this with the officers, getting them to reassess their role in policing, their understanding of policing, we then move into small groups where they are giving scenarios to analyze. Actual scenarios that are coming from Department of Justice reports or other reports where the police have been critiqued because of how they have treated primarily people of color. And so they're giving these sheets, they're giving these scenarios, and then the groups read them and respond, and they answer these questions. How could this particular instance happen? Would police officers do this if they believe they would be caught and held accountable? What is it about either or both the police culture and American culture that leads officers to engage in these types of acts and not believe that they would be held accountable? And so then what we do is pass out these scenarios. And in our training, we've done 3, but we can do more because there's so much that can be done. But I want to read just one of the scenarios to you that we would be using. And this one happens to come from the Baltimore Police Department. It comes from the Department of Justice report on the Baltimore Police Department after the death of Freddie Gray. And it reads, the Baltimore Police Department has long been on notice for such violations, strip searching individuals. In the past 5 years, BPD has faced multiple lawsuits and more than 60 complaints alleging unlawful strip searches. In one of these incidents, memorialized in the complaint the department sustained, officers in BPD's Eastern District publicly strip searched a woman following a routine traffic stop for a missing headlight. Officers ordered the woman to exit her vehicle, remove her clothes, and stand on the sidewalk to be searched. The woman asked the male officer in charge, "I really got to take all my clothes off?" The male officer replied, "Yeah," and ordered a female officer to strip search the woman. The female officer then put on purple latex gloves, pulled up the woman's shirt, and searched around her bra. Finding no weapons or contraband around the woman's chest, the officer then pulled down the woman's underwear and searched her anal cavity. This search again found no evidence of wrongdoing, and the officers released the woman without charges. Indeed, the woman received only a repair order for her headlight. The search occurred in full view of the street, although the supervising male officer claimed he turned away and did not watch the woman being disrobed. After the woman filed a complaint, BPD officers corroborated the woman's story with testimony from several witnesses and by recovering the female officer's latex gloves from the search location. Officers conducted this highly invasive search despite lacking any indication that the woman had committed a criminal offense or possessed concealed contraband. The male officer who ordered the search received only a simple reprimand and an instruction that he could not serve as an officer in charge until he was properly trained. And so what did you hear? What is your reaction? And so you would have officers go through these situations and critique them. And so after this is all over, you've challenged the officers personally and professionally, or you've provided your community members with an overview of what officers need to hear, what they need to see. They will have to make the determination if the role of policing in this country supports or contradicts their values. And if it contradicts, there is hope. If it affirms, it's time to begin termination. And then we move on to the very, very last part. The very, very last part, which is action planning for repairing the breach. And so we ask the officers, after we do the scenarios, we want them to, I'm going to go past this. What have you learned today that can assist you in remaining safe as you serve your community? How can you guard against the police culture that is sometimes the antithesis of what you have been called to do? How will you reverse the perception of all too many community members that the police are racist and not interested in serving all parts of the community? And are you willing to call out racist police officers who use excessive force? There are other videos that could be used. And I just want to show one more really, really quick that was put together by a person who had dealt with policing.
A lot of people think I'm evil just because I wear this badge. But I bet you didn't know that I got into this line of work because I truly care about the community. And I want to make a real difference in the lives of the people I serve. I bet you didn't know that I dream of being a lawyer when I grow up. I play sports and my favorite would have to be baseball. But I really want to study law so that I can make a real difference in my community. I bet you didn't know that when I was 6, my mom and dad gave me the talk. They told me that I have a higher chance of being stopped and abused by police because of the skin I was born in. 15 years later, every time I look through my rear view and see a car with those lights on top, I nervously began to sweat from my palms, even though I have done nothing wrong. I bet you didn't know that this isn't my only job. I also work security at 2 local diners to take care of my wife and newborn daughter. We're scraping by, but we're gonna make it. I love them both very much, and when I'm out on those streets, I just want to get home to them. Let us never forget that we are human. The media tries to push its narratives, but we all carry a more true story inside. And that story is often very different from what we see with our own 2 eyes. Let me emphasize the point. If I told you to go to the ocean and bring me back a bucket of blue water, you would never succeed in a million years. Because see, that water is not blue. Even though that is how it appears, it is actually clear. And so likewise, beneath the blue uniform, under the black or white skin, gray suit, or multicolored tattoos, we are clearly human. All you gotta do is look closer. Listen, I don't know how to fix police and community relationships. I just know that it's broken. And I won't sugarcoat it. Lady Justice no longer seems blindfolded. Trust has eroded, and even though I love the idea of body cameras, until the day comes that we zoom into our own biases, our world will forever be out of focus. Because see, there's one truth and no escaping it. No running away from it, whether white or black. If a person's skin is seen as a weapon, then they will always be considered armed and extremely dangerous. How many more reenactments? How many more shots fired, futures erased? How many more miles of yellow tape will it take until we are no longer undecided about how precious every human life is? And we all respect the badge worn by courageous men and women, but they should never forget what lies 2 inches behind it. The human heart. And if we listen from there, then the police motto will soon go from protect and serve to protect, serve, and care. And we will start to see a human like a human, not just a hue of the man and Mr. Forest for the trees. Call me crazy, but I believe that one day understanding will defeat judgment. Haters will be defeated by lovers, and human potential will then be discovered. And on that day, 7 billion people will finally see what they can accomplish when they love, respect, and care for each other.
So as we come to the end of our time, I've been doing this work for, I'm afraid to admit it, close to half a century. And I would really like for my nieces and nephews and my grandnieces and nephews to live in a different world. And so we have to have these conversations. We have to tell the truth about race in this country. We have to call out people who want to pretend that it does not exist. And so if you have any questions or concerns later on, I invite you to email me. Folks can get in touch with me. If you would like a copy of the curriculum and also a recording of the film, you could do that also. And I'm going to put my, if I can figure out how to do it, I'm going to put my email in the chat box. And so you can just email me and I will send you the curriculum, and you can use it as you see fit. You can share it. After the murder of George Floyd, I put it together and I sent it to about 10 police chiefs that I knew. And a couple of them are starting to use them and want to have the training done in their particular police departments. And so it is yours to use, yours to share. And I just hope that at some point we can stop having these conversations, because we have truly figured out the role of policing, and that we have truly figured out how to love one another as equals in this country. And so if there, I have a question. Yes, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and curriculum. Yes, again, send me your email based on the email, my email that I put in the chat, and how to best connect with local police so that I can connect with the right person in the department. Part of me is also asking this question knowing that there are police departments watching this as well. And that's a good thing for the police departments to watch it, because there's a connection there. But depending upon how your police department is organized, I would go to the person in charge of the local area in which you live. There's also police departments and police chiefs that have advisory police chief groups. If there is one, volunteer to serve on that. If you are ordained, volunteer to be a police chaplain. That gets you in. And so there are any number of ways, and sometimes you just have to pick up the phone. If you go on the websites of most police departments today, they have all the emails and phone numbers of all the commanders, and you can just email or phone and get the information you need. So again, I want to thank Catherine Meeks and Absalom Jones Center, and also Dominique Hardy for being behind the scenes, and for each and every one of you who have stayed through this process. And I just wish you much blessings and mercy as we try to bring God's kingdom just a little bit closer here on earth. As I tell folks, you shouldn't have to die. You should not have to die to share in God's kingdom right here on earth, right here on earth. So again, blessings to everyone, blessings to everyone. I don't know if Catherine, you want some final words, but
oh no, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
So can you just stay on a minute, Gayle?
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Blessings to each and every one of you. Thank you.
Yep, they're leaving. Thank you, Gayle. That was amazing.
Excuse me.
My goodness. Pardon?
Excuse me. There's 15 people still on. So I'm just letting you know.
Okay.
That were.
I see that mine says 9. What does yours say?
Well, it's lowering down now. It's 7.
Yes, 6.
If necessary, I can end it, and then you all can click on the link.
Everybody's about to be gone, I think.
Okay, so 2 attendees and the 3 of us.
Wonder.
What we can do is remove.
Dominique, can you just close it out?
I can. Yes, I'm removing them right now. Give me just a minute to remove the last one. Okay, done.
Oh, all right. Well, I just thought that was phenomenal. Thank you, Gayle. And
it was fantastic.
My goodness. I mean, the videos that you put all this together is just wonderful. And we will put this on our YouTube channel and encourage people to watch it. And then of course they can get in touch with you if they want to, get materials, or we want to promote it as much as possible, because those skits with those parents talking to their children just got the best of me. Good gracious. They were so powerful. And what you said about your 40-year-old son, I feel the same way about my 34 and 39-year-olds. You never can rest.
Nope.
It's just, and my nephews and people don't understand what it's like to live with that.
No, they don't.
On a daily basis. And it's not paranoia, it's grounded in fact. And we know that it doesn't have anything to do with them being good or not good. It just has to do with them being Black.
It just is, as a president.
Yep. Yep. that quote from, was it from whoever said it, that when